Hello everyone, welcome back to Extract the Fact. I'm your host, Adam Israelovitz. So today, unfortunately, will be one of the last topics of the summer, but I'm excited to bring you guys this one today. It's about the federal minimum wage. And now this is a topic that has deeply divided US politics since 1938, when it was established by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, during the end of the New Deal program. This is a really controversial topic, mainly based in economics, obviously, and it's partisan as well. So Democrats will support one side while Republicans will support the other. So we're going to examine those two sides today and let me know what you guys think. So first, I'll be arguing that the minimum wage should be raised. Right now, the current minimum wage is at $7.25 an hour. The minimum wage should be raised to either $10.10, which is a popular left-leaning center ideal, is 10.10, and a more progressive leftist ideal is $15 an hour. So many progressives have this slogan saying "fight for 15" as one of their common lines in politics. Now on the other side, there's a more Republican ideal. The minimum wage should not increase because it would harm our domestic economy with ramifications, and even some on the far right would argue there should be no minimum wage at all, and the federal government should not regulate any part of the economy. But we'll argue that the minimum wage should stay at $7.25 for the purposes of their argument. So we'll dive right in here, and first I'll argue that the minimum wage should be raised. So a core argument is when adjusted for inflation, which happens every year as we go on, $7.25 an hour is simply not a living wage. And the minimum wage is primarily meant to be a living wage. So no matter who you are, if you work a certain standard number of hours and you work hard and you work well and you keep your job, you should maintain a living wage. And people argue with today's inflation rates, $7.25 an hour is not a living wage. So people should say, well, for $15 an hour, or in some cases $10.10 an hour, that is more of a living wage. So people that are working hard, they might not be the highest paid, but they can still maintain a life and bring themselves out of poverty, which brings to the next point, that raising the minimum wage would reduce domestic poverty on a large scale. This is a common talking point on the left and those who support raising the minimum wage. Many cite a 2013 study by the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and they estimated that when increasing the minimum wage to $10.10, again the center-left ideal, it was projected to reduce the number of non-elderly living in poverty by around 4.6 million, or by 6.8 million when longer-term effects are accounted for. So that is obviously a huge number, around 5 million and around 7 million when longer-term effects are used is a clear increase from where we are now, and that would be a clear benefit to those who support the minimum wage increasing. In addition, this is a common contrasting point, so the people who support raising the minimum wage will support this, but the other side will really dispute this. Many argue raising the minimum wage will spur new economic activity and job growth. So economists from the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago predicted that a $1.75 rise in the federal minimum wage would increase aggregate household spending by $48 billion in the following year, and that would obviously boost GDP and lead to job growth, because when the consumer has more money, they can spend it directly in. So that is the ideal of giving money to those who need it the most, and they will inject the economy with more money, and that will increase the GDP. That's kind of the opposite of the trickle-down economics formula, where the top gets the most breaks and then it will reciprocate to the lower economic classes. This is kind of the flipped version of it. Putting more money in the hands of people who will readily spend it helps the economy. That is kind of the fundamental principle here. If you give it to those who need it, they will invest and they will spur the economy with their growth starting from the bottom up. There's also a myth that many people of the raising the minimum wage argument will point to. They'll say, while it is a living wage, people will still be inspired to be motivated and to be more successful in a society for themselves and their families. So there's an argument that says, if the minimum wage increases, they won't be as motivated because everything will just be handed to them. With this minimum wage, they wouldn't have to work to achieve a higher standing, and they could just kind of live comfortably with this minimum wage, and that would not spur economic employment. And that is simply not true. These people argue $15 or $10.10 is simply a minimum wage. That is not something that people are striving for, that is something as a baseline, and then from there they can keep building and becoming more successful. This is not kind of the ceiling for them. They argue that this is the floor, and this will actually motivate them more because now they are living at least somewhat comfortably, and they can then move up the economic class, move up the economic ladder in a capitalist society. In addition, the Economic Policy Institute writes that it would reduce costs for welfare. So if you give more money to people either in poverty or near the poverty line, you won't have to spend more money on welfare services and government services for the poor because people would be dragged out of the poverty cycle. So 1.6 million Americans would no longer be dependent on government assistance programs, and that would save $7.6 billion in spending, which is obviously a huge number. So while we would increase the minimum wage and that would cost more money, it would also, and it would cost businesses more money, it would also save the federal government around $7.6 billion in spending in return. So now we'll flip gears a little bit. As you can see, this is a really just densely an economic issue. There's not a lot of social ramifications here. This is one in contrast to the social issues we did last week. This one is really by the book, and you kind of have to look at the numbers to make your decisions. So we'll argue here that no, the minimum wage should actually not increase. Some argue it should be eliminated. Some argue it should stay at $7.25. So we'll look at that now. So first, the Congressional Budget Office projected that a minimum wage increase from $7.25 to $10.10, again, the standard would result in a loss of 500,000 jobs. So in a survey of over 1,200 businessmen, 38% of employers who currently pay minimum wage workers said they would lay off some employees when it was raised to $10.10. So this is a fundamental principle. If businesses have to invest more money into their workers, they'll reduce their own profits so they can't hire as many workers. So while workers will be paying more, a lot of workers will lose their jobs. 54% of these businessmen say they would decrease hiring levels as well. So this is a long-term implication as well. They would have to fire some employees, and then their hiring process would be greatly shrinked in the future. And this would lead to a decrease in employment, slowing the economy. Now, the current unemployment is at 3.9%. That is of July of 2018. That is a very healthy figure, and that's the lowest it's been in years. And many people will say, "Oh, let's not tinker with that," and many argue that raising the minimum wage would raise this unemployment level. In addition, there's kind of a utilitarian school of thought here. As we can see from a study in the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland now, found that low-income workers see wage increases when the minimum wage is raised, while their houses and employment decline, and the combined effect of these changes is a decline in earned income. Minimum wages increase the proportion of families that are poor to near poor. To the extent that some poor households also lose jobs, their net losses would be greater. So again, this is going back to the original point that while some workers will be paid more, the net loss will be greater because many will lose jobs and many will have a decline in income because of that. So the utilitarian part of this argument is, well, if the net loss is greater, we should not implement this policy, even though it will benefit some workers, but not all. In addition, Jamie Richardson, who is the vice president of fast food chain White Castle, so obviously right from a businessman's mouth here, says that the company would be forced to close almost half its stores and let go of thousands of workers if the federal minimum wage was raised to $15. So this is a actual businessman who is head of a huge company. It's very popular in New York, White Castle, saying it would have to close half of its stores. It's a huge portion if it was raised to obviously the more progressive ideal of $15 an hour. Procon.org also cites Walmart stores in various states because obviously the federal minimum wage, states can change that. So for example, New York has a significantly higher minimum wage than $7.25 right now. That is just the federal guideline. That is everyone's minimum, but states can increase that depending on where they are. So Walmart stores in various states have also closed because of increases in this minimum wage. And finally, there's a huge increase in consumer costs. So if we're not talking about just the workers who are benefiting or not benefiting from the minimum wage increase or status quo, the general consumer, the general public, there's a huge increase in consumer costs. So NBC News found that a price of a cup of coffee went up 10 to 20% in Oakland, California after their minimum wage 36% minimum wage increase was found to hike at $12.25 an hour. There's a fundamental capitalist school of thought in America that goes, the free market should determine wages, not the federal government. So if there's confidence and if the free market is strong, then minimum wages will be higher. This is kind of a more radical thought than having no minimum wage, but it is still a school of thought that is brought forth by this argument. And again, consumer costs would increase. That is a lot of Republicans like to use that to kind of unite their base, even if some of their party is not directly affiliated by the minimum wage. If they're making more than the minimum wage, they'll say, hey, consumer costs will increase greatly if we do a federal minimum wage increase to either $10.10 or to the more progressive $15 per hour. So I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. I think while there are a lot of nitty-gritty studies and it's hard to decipher which studies to trust and which to look at, I think each point here really makes a good argument, and you have to weigh what is more important in society. Is it making a living wage for many or ensuring more employment for all? I think that's one of the core debates, and I think it's interesting to see where it's going. I think Europe and Canada have generally moved to the left this past couple of decades, and the minimum wages have increased there, and in some liberal states they have increased as well, but it'll be interesting to see what the federal government does as well. So let me know what you guys think in the comments. Thanks.